What? Are you crazy?
I've been gone for the last 4 weeks, so I was like,
Oh, wow.
probably leave again.
All right. It is 5:05 on Tuesday, December 4th, 2018. I'll call to order the meeting of the Pickens County Planning and Zoning Commission. Present we have Zach, Jeffrey, Jim, Joe, Chelsea, and Jeff. We have a quorum. We have one item on our agenda for this evening. It's application by Aspen Skiing Company for Aspen Mountain rezoning, ski rec master plan, growth management activity envelope, and site plan review, I think related to the Pandora ski area. So tonight we're just going to have a presentation from the applicant, and then in January we'll have a staff report and continued discussion then. So we'll take the applicant's presentation tonight and have commissioners make any comments or questions to the applicant that we'd like to see them address either tonight or at our next meeting. And with that, I will turn it over to you all. And if you could introduce yourselves and provide your presentation, that'd be great.
Good evening. I'm David Corbin. I'm Senior Vice President, Planning and Development for Aspen Skiing Company. With me from the ski company shortly should be Victor Gurdon, who is apparently AWOL from our pre-meeting getting here. Matt Keeling, and then Heather Henry and Katie Tabor of Connect One, who are a land planning firm, and Dana Gensley Ellis from Rowland and Broughton, who is an architect, and they've been working on the Sundeck Expansion and have kind of modeled the concept for an on-mountain hut or huts at Ruthie's. So that's the design or planning team that you see before you. Forgive me because I don't recall, but I know one or two of you were sitting on the commission when we brought the Buttermilk Master Plan through a few years ago. But it's somewhat of an unusual event for the ski company to bring a master plan before this body. It doesn't happen all that frequently, despite the fact that the county is essentially our primary local regulatory body on 3 of our mountains. Master plans don't change that often. In this particular case, 20 years, and the master plan hasn't really changed. County code really calls for review, revision, update every 10 years or so, but when nothing was happening, there really was nothing to update. So it has been 20 years since this body and ultimately the BOCC had to take a look at, address, and review. There is Victor. Okay, so we're fully present and accounted for now. So it's been 20 years since the county has had an opportunity to take a look at a revised master plan, because it's been 20 years since we've really contemplated making any changes to our operations of the facilities on the mountain or our operating terrain. It's a complicated process when we do so. As I mentioned, we did this at Buttermilk not too many years ago. And that was fairly easy with respect to the mountain components. That was more about the base area and the hideout and some of those other changes that happened at the bottom of the hill in Buttermilk's case. Here, the 2 most compelling drivers, actually I should say there are 3 sort of compelling drivers of why we're before you now with a master plan. One is the Pandora terrain expansion, which I'm sure you're aware of in terms of its public reporting, and also the snowmaking expansion across the top of the mountain, which last year was a particularly acute catalyst for us to come back in and propose some changes for this mountain. And then lastly, this remodel, small expansion contemplated at the Sundeck, which is really driven by some circulation needs as much as anything, and a basic remodel refurbishment of the Aspen Mountain Club, which is at the north end of that building. So those 3 components are sort of front and center with respect to our activities at Aspen and some projects that we would hope to undertake within a 12 to 18 month period from now. So for those reasons, we feel we've got a live and a compelling reason to go ahead and update the master plan and hopefully make changes to it with the county's review and approval. And there are, of course, other things that follow from that in terms of rezoning and that sort of thing. But before I just touch on those, on the federal side, as I'm sure you likewise have seen, we have to go through a master planning process as well. We try as much as we can to make sure that those documents align. And we've, I think, been doing a better job of that in the past few years in both the case of the Buttermilk Master Plan and in another jurisdiction, in Snowmass's case, when we updated the Snowmass Master Plan with the Forest Service a few years ago, and then likewise amended what in Snowmass is called the Mountain PUD Guide, if you will. On the Forest Service side now, we went through a MDP drafting process and submission in 2017, and in January of 2018, the Forest Service accepted the master plan. Forest Service doesn't approve master plans, they accept them, and then when you want to make a project proposal in the federal system, you draft your project proposal basically for things or items or activities or buildings, improvements, whatever, that are in your accepted master plan, submit that, then you go through a NEPA or environmental review process. Just last week, we received the draft environmental assessment and the draft decision notice from the Forest Service approving the Pandora terrain expansion and the snowmaking expansion. On the federal side, we go through a 45-day objection period where those who have commented that previously in the scoping, but who may have reservations or disagree with the environmental assessment or the decision notice, they may object. It's essentially an administrative appeal. After that 45-day process, which commenced really last Friday, and should terminate, I believe, January 14 after you calculate the days through the weekend that the 45th day falls on. If there is an objection, then there's another 45-day period to resolve or administratively determine the outcome that the region does. So we've got draft approval from the supervisor here on those components that are in this plan. We expect that in another 3 months' time, we will have concluded any and all administrative appeals, should they arise, and we expect a favorable outcome and a decision. The EA is pretty well grounded, I think, very well written, and the decision notice, I think, is a strong one. So we're quite pleased with it. It conforms, with one exception, to what's in your application packet and all of the documents that you've been given or burdened with.
Memorized.
Yeah, I'm sure memorized. I'm glad you have. I haven't yet. But it's a lot of content, but they're fortunately indeed that they conform pretty closely. So you have a package that includes that federal master plan as well as all of its exhibits. And again, part of the reason for that is we're trying to make sure that with our local regulatory agencies and with the federal government, everybody's working essentially with the same set of documents. So I have burdened you with maybe more materials than you would want because you got all of their material as well, but that's the reason for it. So we go through the master plan here, and essentially it's our long-range vision of what we'd like to do on the mountain. There are certainly some things in here, and have been in prior master plans, whether on Aspen Mountain or Buttermilk, or even Highlands, I suppose, that might have been contemplated in the master plan, but ultimately not pursued. Such may be the case here. But what we want to try to do is put on the table all of those things we could contemplate or may wish to contemplate in a 10 to 20 year time frame, basically. So that's what you see. As I said, in our particular case, we've got 3 or even 4 projects that we could contemplate with some certainty that we would very much want to do within a 2 to 3 year period. Because there is an expansion of the operating boundary and the ski terrain contemplated, and it goes into what had previously been rural and remote zoning. If we are to expand our operating boundary, and whether in federal land or private land, with the county's zone districts, we're facing the prospect that we would likewise rezone those areas that are rural and remote, or AR10 in this particular case, to ski rec. So rezoning is contemplated in this application. Definition and identification of our activity envelopes associated with those areas on the mountain where we've got sort of dense clusters of activity or physical improvements. That's included in the application and site plan review for a couple of those proposed projects, including the Sundeck, the Pandora's Terrain, potentially the patrol relocation, Buckhorn Cabin, revision, remodels in the future of Ruthie's and Bonnie's and our snowmaking activities. And then lastly, sort of a pro forma requirement of the review would be to consider the GMQS, FTE generation, and those kinds of issues. So all of those items we think are essentially on the table before you. If I could direct your attention just briefly to the screen, the existing mountain operations, I think, are probably fairly well known to everyone. And looking at the exhibit that you see and the map, what's shown are the private areas of the mountain in blue. Aspen is somewhat unique among our mountains in that the majority of it, roughly 2/3 of Aspen Mountain, is really private property, and roughly 1/3 is National Forest Service land. That's very much different than Highlands or Buttermilk, for example, and it's likewise different from Snowmass. So in this particular case, it's sort of an interesting and different model of where and how we've got regulatory authorities to review the property, and to what degree, again, those differing interests and kind of different areas of governmental concern are sort of addressed. Some issues that are important to the Forest Service may not be as important to this body, for example, or you wouldn't have direct regulatory authority with respect to them. They care about links, not really a subject matter for the county. You may care about road access. Forest Service doesn't care as much about road access. So the attention of the two agencies may be quite different. For us, just in terms of kind of meeting some of the perfunctory legal aspects of our application, our access that we have to refer to here primarily is the road access that are described, and those are very simple. Summer Road up the front side, which I believe is County Road 14, and basically the Midnight Mine, Little Annie Road access up the backside or from the south and southeast, which I think is County Road 15A, I think. But those are the two road accesses into the mountain. The road in particular is sort of an interesting wrinkle to our operations, as obviously in winter those aren't open. They're open in summer. In some ways, the county manages and has taken greater effort recently to try to monitor and control vehicular activity on those roads, ATV operation and so forth. But for other reasons, access, truck service access, become issues for the county, and we'll touch on those later. But those two county roads are critical to our operations, winter and summer, really, because in winter we use those roads for snowmobile access and egress, as well as summer service and delivery, primarily up the front side, and our food delivery in the winter likewise goes up the front side via CAT. Ownership is among the private properties is somewhat unique in that title to these properties is extremely interesting because of all of the old mining claims. When you look at the private properties in close detail, they're like shards of property strewn about the mountain in almost pickup stick kind of fashion. They're just spread all over the place. Most of the properties that are really critical to our operation, indeed, probably derive from old mining claims. Many of them were sort of brought by Darcy Brown and the Brown family into the ski company's predecessors in interest ownership. Some actually are, while they may be listed in blue here as private, are actually public in the sense that the county owns a few parcels and tracts up there. We have easements across properties up there. Some of the mineral interests have multiple ownerships to them. But in one form or another, we have legal title and legal interests through fee simple ownership, leases, et cetera, that have been in place since the 50s that allow us our operation, and then obviously are the holder of a ski area special use permit from the federal government for the remainder of our operating boundary up there. We have about 699 acres in our operating boundary, 475 acres of which are really cut trails, and another 224 what the Forest Service might describe as being undeveloped and gladed areas. Obviously, as you know, as a ski product, it's all intermediate and expert skiing. There really isn't beginner area or beginner terrain up there to speak of. If you want to advance, we'll move ahead. So what are the components in our plan? The obvious one I alluded to before is the Pandora lift and terrain expansion. We have a desire, and it was mentioned in the 1997-98 master plan, although not specifically reviewed and approved. It's described in that plan and is noted and spoken of at some length, but the commissioners at that time did not approve it for then operations, although it was in the plan. So now here we are 20 years later, and we're back and talking about essentially the same area. Lift technology has obviously upgraded a great deal since that time, but we would anticipate that that's a key feature of this plan, and one that is sort of critical to our business enterprise and what we think is the guest experience on Aspen Mountain. As I mentioned before, snowmaking is very important for us. We have a gap in snowmaking. Snowmaking right now, sort of the highest level of it goes about to Tortolette Park, in the vicinities of Bonnie's, if you will. That's as far as we go up the mountain. That works reasonably well for all of our race activities and the things that have typically happened in the past on Ruthie's all the way to bottom on the Lift 1A side. It doesn't do us any good to have that gap in drought years. When access out of the bottom is on the gondola, you can go all the way to top, but we don't have connected snow from the top to, say, even the bottom of Ajax Express. It's kind of ironic that we can get to the top. Our main out-of-base capacity, 90% of our lift out of base is basically over on the gondola side. It's even more than that, actually. But by far and away, our lift access is gondola to top, and then we're faced with the problem in a drought year that you really can't ski well from there. So, for example, last year that's problematic. We were lucky. We happened to get just enough snow last year that we were able to at least open with a, albeit weak product. But filling that gap is critical for us long term, particularly when you take a look at what seems to be an inevitable trend in climate change and the fact that we need to make sure we've got access to and skiable terrain that's high on the mountain that you can get to and then repeat ski, maybe have to download from. So long-term strategic thinking, filling in that snowmaking gap is a critical item for us. We also describe in the master plan some potential changes to other lifts and terminals. And again, this is where I alluded before that there may be projects or really sort of ideas and concepts described in the master plan that may or may not be implemented, and these are included. You can see in the slide kind of the two red labels mid-mountain that identify basically chairs in or around the Bell Mountain area. One of which we sort of call the back of Bell chair, which sort of goes up the backside. It goes sort of from Copper and sort of that Glade 1 really up to the top of Bell Mountain. The other alternative is to perhaps shorten the Bell Mountain chair and somewhere terminate it near that juncture of Copper and Spar. So I don't know if that will occur. We've put those into the federal plan and, again, likewise put the ideas into the county plan. We've also noted in the federal plan and have contemplated it here that it's entirely possible with the Pandora terrain that we could decommission the Gents Ridge lift. That upper and, if you will, sort of eastern side of Aspen Mountain may circulate very differently when this pod is created. You can get back into this pod sort of from, coming down Northwoods, cutting back and sort of a reverse trail back into the lower portions of this terrain, much like you've got the reverse back into Temerity over in Highlands. So intermediates, for example, will be able to ski back into this terrain. Don't know how that's going to work. So what we've suggested to the Forest Service is we could imagine moving in, operating the Pandora terrain for a year or two, seeing how the mountain circulates, and then reassessing, do we even need Gents Ridge? Should it be turned off, only used, on peak days? Should we decommission it entirely? What might the future of that be? It's an open-ended question at this point and is something, again, in the master plan for master planning purposes, as well as these other alternatives of what could happen in the circulation of the central portion of the mountain and repeat skiing in and around the Bell Pod without having to go all the way to bottom. So those are concepts and ideas. We also would anticipate that at some point in time we would hope to animate Ruthies or reanimate Ruthies. In ordinary operations, do we need that today for lunch service? In all honesty, no. We don't need those seats in operations to meet our lunch demand, but it offers a particularly attractive platform and venue for events, and it offers the opportunity basically to have lunch or experience other activities up there while overlooking town. And that's unique and is perhaps an overlooked opportunity that we might do something with. So we would hope to reanimate that at some point. It's also at the other end of what's an ongoing application saga in the city. for the Lift 1A, which I'm sure you've also read about. So as the Lift 1A base area is contemplated for redevelopment and a new lift is proposed, it's got to end somewhere. The idea is it, again, would end very close to Ruthie's here. So we see that lift and its eventual replacement, we hope, with a new base at the bottom as having an upper terminus then that might be animated with a facility at its top. Buckhorn is in here simply because we think we can do what we do there a little better. And what's now a bit dated and maybe a ramshackle setting, we thought we could improve the deck and kind of improve the shelter there in ways that took advantage of the vistas and views and could be sort of a popular place to hang out. Ultimately, the patrol station at the top will be decommissioned, raised, and replaced. And in this particular plan, we've contemplated basically moving and appending it to the gondola building, which you'll see in the activity envelope later in our presentation. We hope to continue to make summer improvements on the mountain, albeit not like the improvements that you may have seen at Snowmass that we've done over the past 2 years. At Snowmass, we very much aimed at activities, if you will, that were pretty highly developed. The Alpine Coaster for one, the Canopy Tour for another, a pretty sizable climbing wall, challenge course, a lot of mountain biking trails, flow trails, and so forth. Those are very much developed recreation, many of which require guides, full harnesses, being clipped in all of the time, more formal sorts of activities. The summer projects at Aspen and really the summer experiences are really more just about getting guests to the top of the hill. They're excursions, if you will. The guest experience and the summer activity at Aspen Mountain is get on the lift, go up, ride, take advantage of the views, enjoy those vistas, maybe have lunch, walk around a little bit. And that's a fairly common experience for most of our summer guests who may be urban areas, not particularly athletic, not here for challenging in the wild activities, or here for the more technical, highly skilled, more highly athletic activities that we built in Snowmass. It's a different experience. It's a lighter touch. It's more about just being there and having that view and maybe strolling around a little bit. Yet the locals pound up the trail maybe every day of the week. So we get different user types on Aspen Mountain. We're not attempting or don't anticipate replicating the Snowmass experience. What Heather's firm has done for us in the past, say 3 or 4 years, has been to try to re-landscape the entire top of that mountain, which had been sort of pounded into submission, unfortunately. And we basically went up, scarified, brought topsoils in, re-vegged the whole thing, and tried to restore the alpine environment and the appearance of the alpine environment while providing play opportunities for kids primarily. And we've taken a pretty good stab at that, and the thought is we would expand upon those kinds of activities in the future. And then lastly, Sundeck Expansion, which is actually very modest in scale. It's under 500 square feet in terms of the expansion of the floor area on a 27,000 square foot building. Mostly associated with the club, largely due to desires to revise or change the entrance to that facility, make it a little more functional. So that's really a summary of the components of the plan, if you want to advance, Heather.
So no mountain biking trail development in the works?
We don't have plans. We haven't engaged a mountain bike trail designer, for example. It's really steep. Yeah. So it is used by some people for mountain biking under old authority and our current approvals, we're not allowed to do bike haul up the gondola. One of our asks in this at the end would be we would like to do bike haul up the gondola, but we don't have current plans to design and include flow trails. We could imagine maybe events on the mountain of experts riding downhill and maybe even competing. So there are a variety of things that could happen in the future, but we don't have a plan, and you will see none in your materials, of a lot of new trail design, for example. So could that follow 5 years, 10 years longer in the future? Possibly. Is it a part of this plan? No. One of the other components, again, as I mentioned, would be a rezoning. And the slide that you see presented now basically depicts what that rezoning would be. And again, the new skiers' terrain is largely skiers' right of Walsh's. So if you're at all familiar with the mountain and you ski that side, or at least have gone to the opening and entrance into Walsh's, terrain from there to the right, basically over to the Lucine Pond, and a little beyond that on the upper edges. But that area is essentially the area that we're talking about ultimately for the terrain expansion. And in expanding the operating boundary there, part of it is on private land again, and part of it is on federal land. The thought would be within the county, we would have to rezone roughly 35 acres from AR10 to ski rec, and we would be rezoning roughly 132 acres from rural remote to ski rec. We think those uses are entirely compatible with the adjoining uses, and since the area has been historically used for sort of backcountry access anyway, in many respects it really doesn't change what's functionally been happening up there in terms of the user groups that have been in that terrain for some time. But that rezoning would be necessary for us to fully utilize this terrain. We aren't asking or proposing other development rights go in or be made accessory to that. We don't have, other structures or buildings beyond lift shacks and a small patrol station contemplated as physical improvements beyond the lift there. But that is the area that we would propose to rezone. We don't use it, have not used it, have no development rights associated with it. Of any residential properties now, have not pursued those. In fact, it took a partition action a few years ago for us to fully secure our property interests in the terrain that we're now seeking to convert to skiing. But so that amendment is part and parcel of our application. Pandora's itself, shown for you now. Again, if you are familiar with the terrain, you can see, hopefully, at the top kind of center right, you can see the gondola terminal building. I don't know if you can scroll there, Heather. There you see the gondola terminal building, and if you were to immediately move sort of north-northeast, you are going into the entry of Walsh's. If you want to come down, I don't know how to do that. Okay, there we go. So there's terrain you're familiar with. You're basically looking at the entrance into Walsh's there, and the terrain then is being added largely to the south and east. Fortunately, much of it is sort of a northeast aspect. So snow quality is good. The ability to hold snow is good. It's high. The bottom of this area is about 10,000 feet in elevation, climbing to about 11,200 feet in elevation. So we've got about 1,200 feet of vertical. So it's a very nice skiing pod, top to bottom. The lift contemplated there is a high-speed quad. Slope length is about 4,200 feet, which at 1,000 feet a minute, high speed, leaves you about 4.5-minute ride. So it's very similar in length to what you see at Temerity, but we've gone high speed. There's a little more terrain here, and there's more terrain for intermediates that has been incorporated in this. You can see there are a variety of blue runs, and where Heather has just been kind of circling here, the sort of entire lower third of this, if you look at the length of that lift line, the kind of the lower third of its entirety is blue terrain. So that's introducing what we think is probably a product and experience that's, if not desperately needed, certainly highly desired by our guests on Aspen Mountain, is more intermediate terrain and intermediate glades. It's a fairly moderate slope through there. We also have, fortunately, a couple other ways to get into it for intermediate skiers. One, just after you've come down Walsh's and you've sort of gone through that first upper portion of it that usually bumps up pretty high, but is sort of flat. You can take off right there, go cross slope, and then come back down and have a blue run that Victor's been able to find that would bring you all the way to bottom. So really from the top of that terrain where you would enter now, we think we've found a way for intermediate or certainly advanced skiers to enter that terrain and ski all the way to bottom of that lift. You likewise can come really down North Woods, as I mentioned, and sort of reverse your way back in. I can't see if, I think it's P13, I think, perhaps.
12.
It's cut off the bottom of the.
It's cut off the bottom, but
It's P12.
you can come down North Woods and then return, and intermediate skiers again can get back in, and even low intermediates can come back in on that route. So it introduces a new aspect to our skiing. It introduces a new view. Forest Service found that aspect of it actually pretty attractive, in that Aspen, fortunately, it's a good feature for ski mountains. A lot of north aspect skiing, fall lines right down to town. By the same token, this is different. You're looking out at Independence Pass. You sort of have a different experience. It feels more isolated and remote. I think that's one of the reasons people poach it as side country is it feels like a different experience. And we will admittedly put more users into it. The public will be able to access it more readily and be able to circulate out of it. But we think this is something that is indeed a new experience for Aspen. It's something that's already used, but it's a series of improvements that we think can make it more accessible for far more of our guests. Again, getting out of it and lifting out of it will be very easy, and you get rid of the small hike and then the long traverse out of Ludd's Lane. So one of the downsides to using the terrain now is really circumvented by the installation of the equipment. So that goal of putting in the terrain as well as the lift is really critical for us, and they're part and parcel of the same series of improvements in our mind. If you would. Snowmaking. Again, as I mentioned before, we're eager maybe isn't quite the right word. Last year we were probably desperate to fill this gap of snowmaking, but we're basically putting in 53 acres of snowmaking across the top of the mountain. We'll phase those in. We have the aspiration to cover about 5 to 6 trails here. Good portions of 1 and 2 leaf and copper, silver bell, dipsy doodle, buckhorn, and North American are all contemplated to be subject to new snowmaking. They're the green hatched areas on your presentation map right here. We will phase them sort of from east to west. So in first year of construction, we would hope to go ahead and get that supply side and sort of the intersections from 1 and 2 leaf, copper, and then silver bell, really the covered areas in that first phase of work. One of the important things for snowmaking is water storage. With rising temperatures, with fewer opportunities to make snow, with tighter windows of good temperatures to make snow, it's important to be able to make snow quickly, almost be able to do it instantaneously when you hit your temperatures. And that means having water on hand. So also, in addition to the trails to be covered, we have proposed 2 additional storage ponds. I'm sure you're aware of the Gents Ridge Pond. In your application here, we've got proposals for a second pond at Gents Ridge, which you see low in the map before you. And we first proposed a pond in the Midnight Mine side over on the west. We still are proposing 2 ponds, but last week in getting the decision notice from the Forest Service, in the course of that environmental review, the review indicated that Midnight Mine location was not a particularly good location. It had greater environmental impacts. To put a pond in that location, it would mean more trenching of supply lines and so forth. Soils and other features weren't quite as good. And the outcome of that environmental review and the Forest Service decision was build your third pond, if you will, likewise on the Gents Ridge side, and have 3 ponds at Gents Ridge. The existing pond, and put both proposed new ponds over there in Gents Ridge. There is space available to do it. We can just essentially line them up the hill to the south. We think we can likewise still visually shield them with landscaping. We don't think that they're visually impairing the guest experience. But according to the environmental assessment, it's less impactful. So we will follow that Forest Service directive that was basically handed down last week. So we will be proposing to you with new sheets for this application the switch of that Midnight Mine pond to this Gents Ridge side as well. So storage is contemplated. The thought there is, I think we have about 10 acre-feet that we can store in the existing pond. We are adding about 17 acre-feet of storage capacity. When you look at the snowmaking coverage, ideally, we like to put down slightly more than an acre-foot of snow per acre of terrain. So we're putting in 53 acres of terrain. We'll put, I want to say, 56 to 57 acre-feet of water on those 53 acres to cover our terrain sufficiently to open, get you about 18 inches of cover. That's sort of our target. If you're going to go in and do snowmaking, you want to make sure you get a minimum of a foot, but you're going to try to get about 18 inches of cover, plus or minus. So those 56, 57 acre feet that we would propose to be using on the 53 acres of terrain, we'd store 3 fills. Basically, you do the math on that extra 17 acre feet of ponds, and in about 3 refillings or 3 uses of those ponds, we should have covered our new terrain and completed and filled our gap. And that's not a terrible amount of water, really. We'd probably fill the ponds initially, hopefully in the course of the summer, and almost have a free pond, if you will, to start with, and then would probably refill at least twice, maybe more, with water that we derive from the city of Aspen, as our water service for snowmaking is indeed municipal supply. But that's the storage component. Naturally, when you've got storage, you've got to move it someplace, so there are pumps and pipes associated with this. I think there's a 1,500 square foot structure for pump house to shove water uphill. So you'd also have a water line going uphill, basically along copper, and then ultimately you're going to have a water line going across the hill too, when you think of proceeding across, going from going from the the area of Silverbell across to Dipsey and ultimately Buckhorn on the far side. So we'll pipe up and we'll likewise eventually pipe across. So all of those components would be in our snowmaking system. I touched on this a little before. We don't need to go in much greater depth. As I mentioned, these are potential ideas for what could happen in the future on Bell Mountain. They're concepts, really. They're placeholders, if you will, that we might wish to consider in the future. But we'd thus be able to bring back to both Forest Service and to county applications someday that said, well, we've seen Pandora Terrain operate. We may or may not decommission Gents Ridge, but we've decided that we now have seen circulation change, that we'd like to see repeat skiing change in Bell Mountain. And we might bring one of these proposals to this body or to the Forest Service, in the county's case mostly for grading permits, but in the Forest Service case for another NEPA review on a new lift. But these are ideas and placeholders so that should we decide in the future to bring a project application to both the federal government and the local government, that we'd be doing so according to a master plan and have these concepts in the master plan as options that might be pursued. We have no real detail on what those would be or when or if or what the criteria right now would be for making a change or an addition or a selection on those. That's a wait and see kind of situation. Likewise, as I mentioned, Ruthie's, we do expect in some fashion to have approval of a new Lift 1, if you will, through the city process that's underway. Somewhat ironically, we already have the NEPA authority to put in its replacement. We, Victor in particular, took through a project proposal to the Forest Service, and they undertook a NEPA analysis on a Lift 1A replacement probably 3 years ago. Don't know if I lost him. 3 years ago. And Forest Service approved it, and we're already approved by that body to replace that lift and slightly shift its alignment, moving it about, 60 feet plus or minus closer to Ruthie's restaurant. It slides slightly to the west. About half the distance from its current unload terminal to the restaurant is where that upper terminal would be. And in the current planning, we do that by holding the original Lift 1's alignment at the city's request at the bottom, and then slightly deflecting that lift over the course of its climb 2 to 4 degrees to land where we would like it to and where it's been approved, which we can do physically. But so ultimately, for the county's purposes, while the bottom terminal and the lower portion of that lift is in the city, the majority of that lift, the majority of the towers, its cable, and its upper terminal are in the county. So it's in the county master plan and depicted here. And again, associated, we hope, with reuse of Ruthie's restaurant and in some way reanimating it. The concept for that lift has been described in the city process somewhat extensively, and the idea is it would be what we call a telemix, which is a combination of cabins and chairs hung on the same rope. So you can easily repeat ski without taking off your equipment if you want to ride a chair, or if you're a pedestrian going for lunch at a reanimated Ruthie's, for example, you could go in street shoes, go up in a cabin, and go right to that facility. Likewise, the cabins would allow for winter or inclement weather use of the facility pretty easily for pedestrians. We aren't proposing those uses today in your package of materials and the application. We acknowledge if there's anything that we would do specifically to rebuild, refurbish, renovate, redevelop that facility, we would come back for a special review. We've included it here essentially as a master plan concept and to put it within an activity envelope and essentially have the activity envelope become part of this plan and hopefully approved by the county. But those are all contemplated in the master plan. Next. And in that, we've contemplated the use of mountain huts or hut. And you see them depicted here in site plan. We've got a couple of slides that sort of depict these. You can see the new lift. Heather had just started with the lift terminal, and as you can see, it's about halfway between current unload and Ruthie's current footprint. You see another rectangular box there that would be cabin storage and maintenance. If you think of the Elk Camp gondola, for example, we have immediately rider's right of the Elk Camp gondola at its top, a facility where we've got a little rental facility, if you will, beginner's magic and bathrooms, but also we've got lift maintenance in that building and the ability to take cabins offline, work on them, repair, hang a few if necessary for a period of time. We would contemplate something similar here. So that's what that one box most closely located to the existing terminal is. Then you see the lift terminal itself. Then you see Ruthie's. Then you see this concept of a cluster of small on-mountain huts. Ski rec zoning in the county does permit the notion of on-mountain huts. We've included it in the federal plan. They accepted the notion. Again, to do them, I would have to go back through the feds and go through an environmental review, a specific project proposal, and an environmental review. And I would likewise have to come back before the county with a special review process to address huts or other structures or uses of that sort, as well as the remodel or refurbishment of Ruthie's. But for master plan purposes, we wanted to include it as a concept. We also included that concept in the Snowmass master plan 2 years ago. And we've thought that there is interest by our guests and the skiing public in something that is analogous, but perhaps as not as challenging as a 10th Mountain Hut kind of excursion, but that people who might still want to go on mountain and feel as they're more remote, or that it's more of an adventure than staying at a hotel or a lodge or a condo or something in town, that this would afford another opportunity to do something different on the mountains and be able to be there overnight. And as I said, we've actually proposed it now for both Snowmass and Aspen Mountain conceptually. And if we were to advance it, we'd be back with a special review. These are just some images and illustrations of what those might be like, just to evidence a character. So you've got basically illustratives that Roland and Broughton have pulled, I think, from European analogs. And we just tried to sort of draw or depict how that might be seen as you were coming down Ruthie's Run. And in the lower illustration, you see the lower terminal of Ruthie's Lift on the left, a reconfigured Ruthie's roof line and restaurant on the right, and a couple of huts just immediately down slope of the restaurant, again with Summer Road depicted in place. Can advance, Heather. Again, top of mountain, as I mentioned, we are contemplating that at some point in time we will raise and replace the patrol building. It's, I don't know how to describe it. It's maybe outlived its useful life, but has a strong spiritual life. So it's kind of well loved by the
That's what the
patrol.
prayer flags are for.
Yeah, you've got the full Tibetan prayer flag, yes. But its time is coming as a facility, and we would contemplate replacing it, and it really shouldn't be where it is because of its conflict with the top and the unload of the Ajax Express. So as Aspen Mountain has evolved and the lift circulation and the lift types have evolved and been replaced over time, it's probably time when that building goes to move it, to open the top of the mountain a little bit more graciously to allow for better skier circulation through that vicinity. And we'd move it and basically append it to the gondola building. And as I mentioned, it's in the activity envelope, which we can point out somewhat later. Go ahead. I already touched on it. Buckhorn, we've described a little bit that we would hope to, sort of expand upon a viewing deck there and refurbish that cabin, rebuild it. The sliders cabin that we did at Snowmass last year is sort of the model that we would try to replicate here. It's a very simple structure, rectilinear, about 1,000 square feet plus or minus, sort of a high-quality pit toilet, if you will, appended to it, but restrooms available, which we think would be nice here. Likewise, that particular building, its sliders cabin has deck appended, garage door type entries. You can kind of open it up in warm weather. It opens. We have a lot of guests, and probably more guests than we thought, who took advantage of it in the winter. We'd first contemplated the sliders in Snowmass as the termination point of our canopy tour and the place where you'd come down off your last tower, if you will, rappel out, and then be picked up and returned to top of Elk Camp, or the Elk Camp campus, if you will. And to our surprise, it was extremely popular in the winter, and ski school and instructors were bringing guests and people in all the time. So we could very much imagine the same happening here. Very simple structure, really nice deck, tremendous views, a place to sort of self-serve, if you will, with picnics, beer and wine, and other sorts of party activities. Bonnie's is described in your materials as an expansion, and that's really probably not quite the right word. We've certainly expanded or kind of outlined a larger activity envelope around it, where none had really been defined before, but we don't have any plans to really expand or change Bonnie's structure, no plans to really raise or replace it. It will, in time, though, need remodeling and refurbishment. Probably 8 to 10 years ago, we went in and basically rebuilt all of its structure. We came in, poured new foundations, put new column up through it, put new beams in it, basically tried to hide all of those improvements so that nobody would notice that it happened, and most people don't. But so we've restored it physically and structurally, and have made some improvements to the roof. But the rest of the building envelope in time will need or necessitate some refurbishment, probably recladding, and the interiors at some point in time will need some work as well. But that's really all that's contemplated there. This is a little bit more detail, and it's a subject that we wanted to just touch upon. There's a report in your materials that Resource Engineering put together, and we commissioned the report and submitted it to the Forest Service and the county as part of this application, and to the city some months ago, because we knew that the question of snowmaking and our desire to, again, add 53 acres and 57 acre feet of water, if you will, to our snowmaking usage, we knew would be a concern to all of the regulatory bodies, federal and local. Aspen because they're our provider, and particularly because they are sensitive to what might be criticisms of the city as to whether or not there's sufficient water for all the domestic uses of the city and where and how it should be stored, et cetera. The county, because you and the county will want to know that we've got adequate supply, that we could actually undertake and do the snowmaking we've proposed. And the federal government, of course, for all of the typical NEPA reasons. When we go in and submit to the federal government, we have to basically put forth a purpose and need for what we want to do, and then you essentially have to prove up that it's possible and that it can be done, and that the impacts are not significant or severe, and that impacts such as they are can be mitigated. So for all of those jurisdictions, it was incumbent upon us to show that indeed there is water available to do it. And it's particularly a subject matter that needs light shined on it given drought conditions that have existed across the West and kind of the acute nature that we've experienced, all of us, collectively and personally in the past year or so. I won't go into tons of detail on the resource engineering report. Again, it's in the packet. There's a ton of science, a lot of graphs and data gathering, and I'd invite you to look at it if you wish. The key feature here is the conclusion that's taken verbatim out of the executive summary, which basically states, and what they found was that under existing hydrological conditions, there are sufficient supplies in Maroon Creek and Castle Creek, which are our sources of water, through the city's collection and transmission. Those are the sources we draw upon to meet the traditional snowmaking period needs for us, as well as meeting all municipal and domestic demands through city build-out in 2065, as well as meeting all the bypass flows for Maroon and Castle Creeks. So, as I said, there's a ton of data in that report. This graph, I think, when you take all of it out, this graph is really the most revealing. And if you look at the top graph, for example, what they've depicted there is your average water year. Resource engineering in the city and all the local agencies basically rely upon the same series of studies and data gathering that they share and all model from. And resource engineering went back here and looked at your average water year. And what the bars show you are really the uses that take place in the 3 months when we would make snow. That lower bar, that sort of, if you will, sort of orangish tan bar, is about 27 CFS, as I recall, of minimum stream flows. So those those uses that are basically protected stream flows are what you see highlighted with the cursor right now. That's that first part of each bar. The second part of each bar are really the domestic or municipal uses, and then the top would be our snowmaking in those months. So what you see there are all of the consumptive uses or protected uses of those streams and those collection points, and then everything above it, the headroom, if you will, all the way to that top line, the blue, is excess water. So we've met minimum stream flows, we've met all domestic city needs, we've met the snowmaking needs, and we've got excess water, and fairly substantial excess water, in an average water year. And that's at peak day. And they modeled both kind of your average day and your peak day. So this is sort of your most consumptive use in those periods. So basically what you're sort of seeing when you look at November, and you might go, well, why is it all the way to the end? Well, you're looking at basically a Thanksgiving peak for November, and when would we be really drawing? You're looking at essentially a Christmas week kind of peak in December, and then you're looking out into a Martin Luther King kind of vacation peak in January. So that's where you see the bars placed as you do. Otherwise, it would be, a little confusing. But that's really what they're trying to show there. They've looked at it somewhat differently when we might actually be making snow and trying to put snow down in a drought year. And obviously, we're going to be trying to put snow down earlier. You may see consumptive use occur earlier in drought years as they see it. But the drought year that they used is one a few of us here are probably old enough to remember. But 76, 77 winter was the last most horrific drought year, lowest snowfall. What that means for the water year, though, is when that snow melt occurs, and it's the next year. So that's why you see this drought water year described as drought water year 78. It's basically your runoff year following the year of particularly low snowfall. So this is the worst year in living memory. This past year was close, but not quite as bad as the worst year in living memory. But again, same analysis. We took a look at that and said, okay, if everything is our worst drought year ever, and we're looking at those same uses, and we take a look at preserving minimum stream flows, again, that reddish orange bar at the bottom, the domestic uses and our proposed snowmaking uses, we still maintain those minimum stream flows, we still meet the city's needs, and we still can make snow, although the headroom available of actual existing water in the stream is getting pretty thin. There's not much water left over and above, say, the minimum flows that are preserved in the stream. There isn't much excess left. We could find ourselves topped out. And again, they're looking at the worst year ever. Could there be another worst year? Possibly. What happens in that case? Well, we're a purchaser. We have a water contract with the city that has been long-standing and runs through 2020. We anticipate that they will remain our water supplier in the future, and will renew a contract with the city going forward from 2020. But for now, if we were to have an extremely severe drought year, say before that contract's up, we're still under contract, they're still serving us, et cetera. If we would find ourselves running out, if minimum stream flows were met, domestic uses were such, and that blue line were still down and meeting the top of the city's line, we'd be turned off. So we know, and under our contract with the city, we know if there is no supply beyond domestic, we're the first guys to go. And that's just the way it is. So in that case, the rest of the water is preserved as much as possible in the stream. But again, at the bottom here, all the minimum stream flows are preserved. So that's a ridiculously synopsized version of what a far more technical report says. But that's the essence of it. There's enough water there, and under ordinary circumstances, there's enough water quite comfortably for us to continue to do this and to make snow. Under extreme or drought conditions, there probably is still enough water there to make snow. That, for us, is particularly encouraging. We think that hopefully that will be something that is of comfort to the county in looking at our uses here. As I said, we shared actually and vetted this information with the city and their water council in particular before we ever went public with it in the federal process or submitted as an exhibit. So we cooperated with and communicated openly with the city about this report and its contents and gave them the opportunity to review and to comment in the federal process. And I don't know if they will actually comment in the county process, but they ended up, I think, not filing a public comment during the federal review, in part because I believe they're satisfied with this explanation and are likewise comfortable with it. So we feel pretty good about the supply side. The next issue is really, where does it go? This also is a concern to city, and they want to make sure that if we add, again, 56 to 57 acre feet of water up here, it doesn't suddenly come splashing down into the urban area. We've been fortunate that it's probably been on the order of 20 years since there was any real significant debris flow associated with Aspen Mountain operations. I think the last of which were in the 90s on the Keno Gulch side. That still remains an area of concern and interest to hydrologists and to stormwater managers. But the city also is concerned about what could come down the front side, how's it treated, and beyond that, aside from what might be a debris flow issue, what about just sedimentation? So for us, this is likewise a subject that we have to be somewhat concerned with. As I said, we've got 53 acres that we're going to have new snowmaking on. Of those 53 acres, about 30 acres drain ultimately to Spar Gulch. So we're going to put 53 acres of new snowmaking. That water, 30 acres of it, ultimately all ends up down Spar Gulch and essentially enters the city's stormwater system over near the Aspen Alps and the Little Nell. Basically, that's where it goes. And for us, one of the primary goals was to make sure we did not exacerbate water or the potential for debris flow in Keno Gulch. So in the course of the environmental review with the federal government, again, resource engineering was the engineer of choice, in that case by the consultants for the Forest Service, SE Group, who did the environmental assessment, and the Forest Service engaged resource engineering to do the stormwater management side of this study. And their recommendations were that no more additional water should be sent to the Keno Gulch. So what they proposed at our summer ditch, which you may be familiar with if you've walked the upper portions of the mountain in the summer, fairly large ditch runs basically across and down the face of the dumps, if you will, and then around and to the west, down into Keno Gulch. The thought was no more additional water should be introduced into that drainage. So the recommendation is you do a splitter structure, which basically captures of those 30 acres that are sending water down towards Spar, you capture that portion of it that what already exists and goes through the ditch to Keno. Any excess, anything new, if you will, caught, captured, and sent down Spar. Now, down Spar, it was determined that that's not a very good water course. It's not a consistent stream by any means, but it's where runoff goes in the spring. Runoff goes down Spar, no question about it. And it's not very well maintained for water management right now. So there are a variety of things that are being contemplated for stormwater management. Mac will describe those in just a little bit more detail.
All right. As David was talking about, there's the 30 acres of new snowmaking that we put on the upper portion of the mountain with the new snowmaking. That then turns into 23.3 acre feet of increased yield of water on the slope. So when the water goes down that yellow portion on the map there, it then hits the summer ditch and then it gets into the splitter box. From the splitter box, we're capping the splitter box and engineering it so that the same amount of water that's going into Keno is continuing to go into Keno, and any overflow then goes into Spar. And then essentially from that splitter box down to, if you want to go to the next slide real quick, Heather, since we're going down to the junction of Copper and Spar, the stream disappears. There's some runoff. There's a whole bunch of other, kind of as David alluded to a second ago, not very well maintained ditches, and there's no water bars, other just really simple BMPs that could be installed on the hill. So in that lower section of the hill, where we connect to the city's storm sewer system, we're going to be doing improvements of upgraded riprap ditches. We're going to be adding rock check dams. We're going to be adding diversion swales. That entire section of trail where you turn left around Kleenex Corner, if you do the straight shot to get to the bottom of the bell chair, that's sometimes open but mostly not. There's currently a road there that isn't maintained. It's a really common place where extra debris can go into the city storm sewer system. We're going to decommission that entire road through that section. We don't need it. We're going to revegetate it. We're going to do those same kind of best management practices in there. And then there are 4 existing sediment traps, again, that haven't been maintained probably since they were constructed. So we'll be refurbishing, rehabilitating those 4 sediment traps. And essentially we'll be taking the city storm sewer system has a capacity of 72 CFS for the line, and currently we put 3.3 CFS into it, and this will, with what the engineers are saying, after all these BMPs are done, even with the added water up top, it gets to 3.4, 3.5 CFS, which is completely, I think it's 0.003% added, which is within what the city has accepted. We've met with the city's stormwater department, we've met with their energy department, et cetera, and in conjunction with the Forest Service to go over all of these plans, and they're happy with the additional BMPs and what will be happening. If you go back one slide, you'll see the 5 different colors there. Those represent 4 different drainages. The yellow and purple are the Spar, which we just went over, and then there's the red, the light blue, and the green. And those are 3 unnamed tributaries that are all within the Pandora expansion boundary. The lower 2 of those will be getting additional snowmaking on them. The upper green one will not, so the green one will be acting as it always has been. No additional snowmaking, no additional BMPs are needed. As far as tributaries, unnamed tributaries 1 and 2, the light blue and the red, those, what we're planning on doing with those is diverting the water, adding bar ditches, adding BMPs, and pushing the water to the storm ponds, or to the snowmaking ponds. And that has, again, satisfied the hydrologists and their demands for mitigation. So,
Great.
One thing I just might add is, as Max said, those improvements were really coordinated with the city and sort of vetted with the city and the city engineers as we went through, because that they had described to us and spoken of their concerns or interest and wanted to make sure that those were addressed in the NEPA documents. So that coordination was, I think, valuable to all of the parties involved. And by doing that up front, I think we managed to avoid the necessity for the city to supply a whole series of engineering comments, comment back, and exchange a whole lot of paper. We were, I believe, able to do that up front and then just bring all of that discussion, the engineered aims, into the decision notice. So that's become part of our draft federal decision notice already. And there, all of these improvements that you see described here, we would ultimately, again, to the extent that they involve grading or other earthwork, will need county permits. But all of those improvements to the drainage and the controls that are being added to the drainage and really sort of the revegetation and rehabilitation of it are now required of us in the design criteria that have issued in that federal decision. So they will be done, and there's no question about it. These are all things that will happen. And again, in coordination with the city, hopefully to alleviate their concerns about that water management.
Yeah, and just one last thing, just the timing of all those improvements, again, per the Forest Service decision notice, is that they need to happen in conjunction or ahead of any of the snowmaking improvements being turned on. So,
Great.
Another project, as I mentioned, we're proposing to slightly expand the Sundeck physically and to somewhat remodel or make revisions to the Mountain Club component of it in particular. And I'd like Dana Gensley-Ellis of Roland and Broughton to describe that for you, if we may.
Thank you. So the goals of this project were to improve the entry into the Mountain Club. Currently, the way you would get there is to walk under a covered walkway on the exterior and go in a single door. I honestly had never noticed it was there until working on this project, but the idea is to improve the entry, reconfigure the interior with a larger boot room, restroom area, and add a small dining component off the existing bar. The total square footage we're adding, if you don't mind going to the next slide. The total square footage that we're adding is 477 square feet, and for just spatial reference, I counted the 24 by 24 inch ceiling tiles. It's literally from here this way. That's it. It's quite small. And we looked at a lot of different configurations of how to sort of fill in. And the lower left green infill area is infilling what is currently covered exterior walkway and expanding that covered area out. We do have some pretty extreme snow shed off those roofs, so extending the covered area was important for pedestrian safety. And then the green area sort of in the center is connecting two volumes and creating an alignment to an existing wall. So both are quite minimal. The remodel of the club also includes, new restrooms and then just new finishes, lighting fixtures, acoustics, and furnishings. So other than that, the interior of the club stays pretty much as is, with the exception of the boot room, restroom area. The exterior changes are minimal. This shows on the top existing conditions, and on the bottom the proposed changes. And what we did was we took the existing roof angles for the entrance to the sun deck, took that as the primary architecture, and the entrance to the Mountain Club becomes a downscaled version, but still reads as entry, which currently there is no formal entry to the Mountain Club. On the left, you'll see the backside. This is from the Bell's Vista decks area. That expansion infills, two forms, and it also creates an opportunity for circulation directly out to the vista decks, which currently any circulation has to go out through the front and around, or through the deck off the backside, which seasonally might be closed off or not used. So that sort of all-season access out to the exterior, that enhanced circulation was a large goal of this as well. And just for reference on how small of a scale this project is, the building area of the Sundeck is 24,312 square feet, and the 477 square foot expansion is 1.9% of that. So quite small. This building has gone through numerous kind of infills like this over time, and we felt like this was sort of keeping in the character of those smaller expansions without doing any major revisions to how the building is perceived to the public. That's it.
Great, thanks.
One of the other things that's interesting, we've talked about sort of the components of the plan at this point, and we'll move on to a couple of the other topics such as the envelopes in just a moment. But we've talked about a lot of these components, but we wanted to touch upon the uses and really sort of permitted activities that have a long history with this building. In your application materials, you'll find a pretty lengthy or sort of exhaustive tables. Table Roman 2:1, which are 8 pages of grid that describe basically what the activities or uses were that were initially approved in this building 20 years ago, and adopted in Resolution 9880, and became the strictures, if you will, of what you could or could not do in the building over time, which have been subsequently modified by 5 different resolutions and amendments over that 20-year period. I wasn't with Aspen Skiing Company 20 years ago. Victor was part of that process at that time. But, the history of it was one of perhaps great county concern or anxiety about what happened, what might happen, how might that be used, what would night uses be like. The whole Sundeck approval and replacement of the original Sundeck at the time was politically very sensitive, and the approvals for it were extremely detailed, down into all kinds of things, like, our managers having to publish notices in the newspaper a week ahead of time, for example, if you were to have an event up there or something like that. You could or could not use certain doors to the gondola to access. The regulations, if you will, around the uses were very strict because there was no precedent, if you will. Nobody knew what was going to happen, so it was sensitive. Gradually, and there were a lot of constraints about what you could do, who could use it, of what kind of event, for how many nights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on what hours, and could you even run the gondola continuously while you did it. Over the course of the years and the past 20, but really mostly in the first 6 of operations, those restrictions were modified and changed. People sort of got more comfortable with what was transpiring, what happened, who used it, how it was used. Oh, there weren't really so many impacts that, people were concerned about. And gradually, a lot of those uses and restrictions were modified and frankly softened. More events, more activities were allowed, more uses were allowed, and they all became accepted through these various amendments. And there are still some of those restrictions, if you will, that technically, in effect, are still on the books. And what I tried to do with this document was to try to go through by topic and describe over time how those various resolutions and amendments change the permitted uses and activities and the restrictions or regulations regarding them. And then in the final column, tried to describe what we were proposing would be in the resolution that hopefully this board would recommend to the BOCC and that the BOCC might ultimately adopt. In its simplest summary, what we would like and hope would be that the effect of this application and the restated master plan, in effect, would then fully replace the old 97-98 master plan. And all of those items inclusive would be then made part and parcel of the new master plan, even those we might not specifically speak to or discuss here tonight. But what we would like on the operational side is simply to acknowledge and hope for that night use and regular business operations of the gondola and the Sundeck would be permitted year-round, which they are now. Ultimately, it was determined that, yes, you could operate year-round, but we would suggest that that be continued. For public use, without discernment or distinction really between what might be private events or charitable events or other events and certain numbers of events associated with each kind of those uses, we'd just say we would hope that this would be open for night use and regular business operations year-round without those kinds of specific restrictions on the number, type, or user types of the events. On the permitted capacities, taking aside or being subject to the fire codes and building department regulations, of course, originally, I think there were very strict restrictions on the numbers of people you could have there. I think it was 200, 225, something like that. The special event standard in Pitkin County essentially is 500 people. So what we would propose that we could have at any time that the building might use or accommodate up to 500 people at one time as its numerical restriction, again, subject to fire or building codes. But then thereafter, we'd meet that special event number, and then anything over that, you'd obviously be subject to filing for a special event. But so we've just basically made the use continuous and tied it, or would propose to make it continuous, and tie it to the county code with respect to when you have to get a special event permit. Event and guest access. County concern, quite clearly, when you go back into the old documents and rezos and so forth, county was very concerned about whether or not you'd see a lot of vehicular traffic up to the mountain. We don't want that. County doesn't want it anymore, I'm sure, either. So that for us, we agree and accept to the idea that event access, customer access, if you will, for events, guests, and staff would be by gondola. That's what we want to do. That's the most efficient way to get people there. We don't want to introduce vehicular traffic up the front or the back by those guests. So we'd propose, again, sort of per existing rezos, that event and guest access for the ordinary use and operations would be up the gondola. Only emergency access, gondola goes down, some other, wildland fire, whatever it may be, only in those circumstances would you have other vehicular access up Summer Road, Little Annie, or Midnight Mine roads. So we see those as only for the public as emergency situation kind of alternatives. Maintenance and construction access is something of a different story. Maintenance and construction access, we propose, shall be made via Summer Road and Little Annie Road, subject to approved construction management plans. If we were to build the lift, if we were to build snowmaking, for example, if we were to timber trees out, you pretty much have to use Little Annie. There's no other alternative to it, quite frankly. So for all of those, we'd be coming in with a construction management plan, both to the federal government and to the county, seek approval for both. We'd be subject to those reviews and approval, but we would expect we would use Little Annie for those kinds of activities. Our use of Little Annie Road in all other conditions is subject to the county concern of not plowing it. We're not permitted to plow it now unless pursuant to one of those special requests and construction management plans. We accept that and are amenable to leaving that sort of restriction in a resolution. I think there are a variety of county concerns in that regard. I won't try to speak for the county in that regard now, but we accept that fact and aren't proposing that we would be given any other alternatives to it. We do have other access that goes up. And we've included in your materials, and you may not have seen it, a couple of pages that are described as Appendix H, ASC, Supplemental Information Concerning Mountain Operations, Sundeck Service and Delivery. And there's been a concern and a staff concern for some time to make sure that we, in effect, don't overdo or overuse that road and engender complaints from Castle Creek or kind of lower Little Annie side residents. In winter, before winter starts, we supply the Sundeck restaurant, and we have basically 3 truck trips on 2-axle supply trucks that go up Little Annie, go to Sundeck, unload, and go down. So in October, before the roads are lost to snow, we basically have 3 trucks that go up. During winter operations, all of our food and beverage comes through the Nell, goes through the Nell system, goes out the backside, goes on to Cat, and we drive it up. Some supply goes up gondola in the cabins, but that gondola isn't really built as a transport gondola. So essentially we supply the front side via Snowcat. Likewise for Bonnie's is likewise basically served and supplied the same way in winter. And our personnel basically go up the lift, unless you're on a snow machine as a patroller or working in lifts or something and are coming up the lift 1A side largely. Everybody else is going up lifts. So that's winter. We really don't have a road impact to speak of in winter. In summer season, we likewise, for all of our major food and beverage supply for Sundeck, we truck it up the front, up Summer Road, comes in again through the Nell. We put it on a little flatbed that we've got, and our routine service to Sundeck for our food and beverage operations goes up front side. What we do for events is a little more complicated. We don't typically separately supply or bring up materials for events. And by far and away, the largest type of event we have are weddings. We have about 60 to 70 weddings, plus or minus a year, a summer, up there. And for the most part, they employ wedding planners, event planners themselves. And it's not uncommon and perhaps usual for those wedding planners to bring supplies, goods, and materials for the weddings themselves. We have people come up and literally fully redecorate for weddings and events up there. And so they usually average about 1 truck trip up and down, full trip, per wedding event. So for events, yes, there is truck traffic up and down on the backside. But again, they're usually limited to 1 to 2 trucks for those wedding events. We believe on average that there's about 1 truck a day, plus or minus, that will be going up and down Little Annie Road in service of those events. We haven't had any complaints on that, literally, in years. So we've had a couple, I should say. There have been a couple of complaints where a service truck did slide off on the road below, but I believe, and I think I noted it in that attachment, that that was actually a grease truck that we send 3 trucks up in the summer to empty the grease traps on the restaurant. One of those went off the road, slid off the road, and we did receive a phone call complaint to one of our food and beverage managers. But otherwise, we've had no complaints or written complaints to operations at all regarding those ordinary trips. The only other truck trips we have up the backside that are related to operations in the summer are basically to fill our fuel tanks for cats. And again, we send trucks up Little Annie Road. They have to be relatively small fuel trucks comparatively. And we have trucks that go up there, and we have about 10 trips a summer. So operationally on the backside, between fuel and grease trap removal, we send up 13 trucks in the summer, and we have 3 trucks that bring food and beverage supplies up. So that's it in terms of our traffic on Little Annie Road up the backside, is that summation. So relatively modest, and again, we think not particularly onerous in terms of the impact, and for years we've heard no complaints or discomfort about it from anyone down below. But we would hope to continue those uses and believe they should be allowable on a county road, are amenable to other controls or remediation if there's anything that were to arise in the course of these approvals, but as far as we know, it's fairly non-impactful. Noise and other restrictions. Since the 97-98 review and approval, we've been under an obligation to limit night noise at our property boundary at 55 decibels. We're proposing that should remain unchanged, so that's fine with us, and we believe it's appropriate and accurate. There's kind of nobody else up there but us, quite frankly, so we really don't functionally impact anyone that we're aware of in terms of our events or noise of operations up there. The county has long exhibited and described a concern that they did not want our operations and our gondola access in particular to serve or support other activities by third parties that could occur in rural and remote zone district. The county doesn't want us to be sort of a stairway to somebody doing something large and rural and remote. We agree. We've got no quarrel with that whatsoever. We're fine with that remaining as a condition or a regulatory restriction with respect to our use. Have no desire to support that by other third parties. So that's fine with us. The earliest approvals 20 years ago likewise had a variety of reporting and sort of paper requirements to monitor and describe if there were events or activities or the number of people or if accidents and things occurred, and we really haven't had any problem with those things. And a monthly reporting system or anything like that we think is really inapplicable. If there is an emergency event at this point in time, I think you would see typical police, fire, and in our case, if it's winter or summer, patrol reports that would be generated. But we'd suggested that unless requested or needed by community development in some way, shape, or form, we'd propose that any reporting requirements that might have first been applied in the last master plan approval be removed at this point as being really unnecessary. We'd also suggest and propose that evening uses of our other facilities would be permissible in time, Ruthie's in particular, and again, only as a use concept at this point in time. And as I mentioned before, We recognize that if we were to reanimate Ruthie's and propose evening and night use and refurbish the building or do anything else with it, we would come back before you and the BOCC with a special review application. But generally, we'd just like, for master plan purposes, to acknowledge that other night uses could happen elsewhere on the mountain, and in particular, that facility. We don't really have any other plans for Bonnie's or anything else to be used at night, but still, as a use, we want to make sure that that's sort of considered more broadly than just at the Sundeck. The summer programming and other uses, we've sort of described generally where they could occur on the mountain. As I mentioned before, we don't have any other explicit plans or drawings and proposals or facilities that we would submit to you now, but that we would hope to continue what you've seen in the way of summer landscape and activity improvements that we've done in the last few years, and that those would be continued and perhaps expanded in terms of their areas. We also could envision and anticipate other small hiking and walking trails up there. We would also hope that bike hauling would be explicitly permitted under this particular master plan and reso that might approve it. Finally, on GMQS, snowmaking, ski school, other lift operations, they're all very sort of unusual activities when you start looking at FTE generation. If you sat on the commission when buttermilk came through, you may remember that the way this topic is handled, county code typically looks at commercial type of uses, and there are a variety of them in the code, and they're sort of imputed or defined presumptions about how many FTEs may be generated by a particular type of commercial use. Storefront retail being very different from warehouse, being very different from office, for example. Well, our buildings don't really speak very well or speak for how many people we've actually got on the mountain. So the process that's been used for the past 20 years with respect to FTE generation and assessment for our mountain uses, from the Aspen Mountain Plan of 97, 98 to Highlands and then to Buttermilk, is literally to do an actual audit. And we basically give Suzanne a whole pile of HR records that describe by department, by department, by department, all of the hours incurred, and they tie to all of our payroll. So it's reasonably easy for us to prepare and submit. But we give literal hours of accounted work hours, convert to FTEs, et cetera. The FTEs here were sort of first described in the 97, 98 master plan. And then there was an allocation for those. We had a variety of mitigation factors and dedications we had to meet. We subsequently dedicated, I think, in excess of 26 beds or FTE equivalents, if you will, for housing. And in 2008, with a summer activities review at the time, went back with staff, went back through all of the resos, kind of revisited what all of the requirements were initially established, how they had changed over time, what had been met, and this baseline was recalculated at 164.4 FTEs established as our working baseline with the county at the time, and we have proceeded to follow from that baseline since then for Aspen Mountain, looking at our FTE compliance. And there's an exhibit in your materials which basically shows that baseline. It shows kind of the original numbers that we worked at 20 years ago. It shows sort of like, I think, the last 4 or 5 years of our data. And essentially over that period of time, we've basically held from about 145 to about 160 FTEs across the mountain. We kind of go up and down a little bit, wobble, but And it changes. You may have more or less snow management depending upon how much snow you've got. You may have more or less snow making depending upon how much snow you don't have. We've tended to see our F&B employee counts and hours associated with them rise slightly, and we've seen a lot of our operational numbers shrink a little, in part because maybe lifts don't run all the time, like the Bell chair, for example, or the Nell chair. So compared to 20 years ago, we may not see as many hours on time of lift. So you've seen some attrition of hours in those areas. We've also got an entirely new way to ticket, scan, et cetera. So the number of hours associated with getting on a lift has changed. So when you look at that data department by department, you'll see fluctuations over time. Some kind of grow and some have declined. And we saw similar trends at Buttermilk, for example, when we went through that data. But in any event, what I think is encouraging is that over the past 20 years, we've stayed essentially flat. We've stayed within those criteria that were established 20 years ago. We've stayed within our baseline that was reaffirmed in 2008, and we were pretty well below it last year, understandably. We could imagine, though, that we could see growth with new terrain, new lift. It's certainly possible. By the same token, we may add a lift and turn one off. So the proposal here is to follow the methodology that has been done in the past with respect to ski area personnel, to do an actual audit, to do it 2 years after the Pandora terrain, the Sundeck Expansion, or the reopening of Ruthie's occurs. I appeared before the APCHA board last week. They accepted the 164.4 baseline, agreed with using that as a determining factor, suggested and are recommending to this body and the BOCC that 2 audits be done at 2 years and at 5 years. Before that body, I accepted that. I'm fine with that. So what we had proposed was an audit at 2 years. I've subsequently agreed in front of that body for 2 audits at 2 and 5, and we're fine with that. Probably makes sense to take 2 looks at it to see how the activities evolve. But if we then exceed our 164.4 baseline, we will owe the county mitigation at that time per the code. And that's fine. We're fine with that. We accept that. We understand that's how this works. So that's our take on the FTE generation side of GMQS. Our only other concern with GMQS, and here I don't think we have a timing issue considering when we want to do the Mountain Club remodel. But in the case of Buttermilk, for example, a few years ago, we wanted to proceed with Hideout more quickly and some other things, and we asked at that time for sort of an exemption from the timing and submission requirements that the county typically would go through, because when you do ski area improvements, you can either do them and do them all at one time together, or you can't do them at all until the next summer construction season. I don't think we'll be asking for some leeway or a variance on the timing of an actual GMQS application to get an allotment in this particular case. But if necessary, and if we see that to be the case, that's something we might ask for. We have asked for it previously, and in the case of Buttermilk, that was granted. But otherwise, we understand our applicability. We're somewhat of an unusual case with respect to GMQS and the FTE components. With that, I'd turn to Heather to talk about activity envelopes.
I might take a quick minute here to pause
Sure.
you. So we typically only go until 7, and we're bumping up against that timeline.
Okay.
How much more time do you think you guys have here?
We could do that in 3 minutes.
Sure, 3 minutes. I was going to thank you profusely for hanging in there. So I appreciate that check-in. I think that the last pieces that I have to talk about are some that you're generally a little bit more familiar with, so we could move pretty quickly through those. And you'll see much greater detail in your application. So I'm just going to go through the activity envelopes and then the rezoning, and we'll go ahead and just kind of blast through that pretty quickly for you. So primarily, with our activity envelopes, what we're looking to do, as David mentioned, is make sure that we're aligning all of these processes and the improvements with what is in place in your current code. So in 97, 98, activity envelopes were not included, say, in the master plan and in documenting those and kind of ground truthing those around uses that were either in place or were going to be contemplated, because it just wasn't a process that was there. So with this concurrent application, in many respects, we're locating activity envelopes around existing uses. So David's gone through these primarily. So just to orient you, this is what you're going to see in your packet as it relates to activity envelopes. One of the first ones is essentially a contiguous activity envelope at the top of the mountain. And you're going to see one of the things that this really shows primarily is the proximity of the new, so this is the top of the new proposed Pandora lift, and its proximity to the existing gondola building. So what we've done, again, is a contiguous activity envelope that would allow for the uses that are contemplated in the master plan to occur within it. Now, most of these say primarily the patrol rebuild, so taking down the existing, appending that to the gondola building, that requires the next step of a site plan review. But at this point, we're able to locate the activity envelope for all of these areas so that it smooths that process to move forward quickly. The next, is Buckhorn, and David did mention this, really described as an expansion similar to the slider cabin, as he mentioned in Snowmass. This is now orienting you effectively to the north, so skiing is downhill from where you see this. This activity envelope encompassing plenty of the area for access, infrastructure improvements, etc., to expand the cabin and what we would call a party deck. This, in your application, you'll see that rough sketch of what that Buckhorn expansion might look like. Bonnie's similarly has been described as an expansion. Really, this is just an upgrade and an improvement plan. Let's maintain it and make sure it doesn't fall down, or a refurbishment plan. But the activity envelope, again, encompassing enough area that we're confident that some of the infrastructure improvements as well, water service, etc., can be done within that activity envelope. Finally is Ruthie's Restaurant and Cabin. Now, as David described earlier, there is the concept both of the Lift 1A terminal and that terminus being here. And again, the idea of 10th Mountain hut-style cabins being here below. And this activity envelope both encompassing any access improvements that we would have to make, as well as the cabins, the improvements to Ruthie's restaurant itself, and the top of the lift terminal and storage facility. So large envelope, but again, anything further and the detail related to it would go through a site plan review process, and in particular for the use of the huts special review. So lastly, our Pandora rezoning. You will see the entire section in your application related to the rezoning and what you all will be looking for criteria for approval. So we've touched on a lot of these through the master plan that David has described at length. But talking a little bit, I wanted to just highlight a few of those that you're going to see. So changing conditions. As the Forest Service has indicated in our master plan, it's a changing industry. Skiers are looking for a different experience. They're looking to make sure the whole family can ski the mountain, etc. With the Pandora expansion, and you'll notice even in the positive notice of decision from the Forest Service, that they've really described this ability to create a different aspect, a different view for skiers, different terrain with this expansion, but doing it in a way where it's extremely contiguous. And that's unique right now in the industry, to be able to do this kind of quality expansion contiguous to the existing uses. So those changing conditions really of the industry look at this area, right, as a perfect fit to be able to meet those changes while doing it in as consistent of a way and obviously with no adverse impacts. So we're kind of talking to a few of these bullet points that we have up there. Specifically, for consistency with the applicable land uses, throughout the Forest Service document and the master plan that you see itself, that outlines a number of elements, say, of any environmental impacts that may occur, how those are addressed, etc. Then the other aspects really of consistency with the land use are much more about, say, community impacts. So to our water service, stormwater, some of the things that we've already gone through. We've gone through traffic as it relates to access. Talking about traffic as it relates to the community is also in our application. So Aspen Mountain, again, is very unique in the fact that, unlike Snowmass, that may be a destination for our visitors and our skiers, many are visiting Aspen themselves and then using mass transit, both the visitors and the employees. So with the Pandora expansion and the rezoning itself, seeing the limits to just the overall capacity of the mountain and really focusing more on the quality of that has reduced the impacts both to public facilities and kind of in general adverse impacts. The east of Aspen master plan and the overall comprehensive plan talk about the preservation of open space and recreational uses on the face of Aspen Mountain. So this application, in our view, taking AR10 zoning and rural remote zoning, placing that into ski rec, really reinforces those land use policies and what those are looking to do to boost recreational tourism within the county and remove those lands really from the possibility of development. So we think it really reinforces those aspects of those two plans in particular that really guide this area of the mountain. And then obviously consistent with both adjacent land uses and community character. So again, this is a very unique opportunity to make this expansion directly adjacent to exactly the same uses, and that doesn't happen very often, and so it's a really exciting way to look at this rezoning and this terrain expansion. In the public interest, again, primarily one of the top goals for the county has referenced the ability to increase recreational tourism and use that as a way to facilitate economic benefits to the county. And this is seen as for this area, the ability to have new terrain, different experiences, and really boost the visitorship, but in a limited way and in a way that is people coming back that are coming each year, and now they're coming back for some of this new terrain. So those are, that's about as quick of a snapshot as I could give you of several pages in the document that goes through the criteria of approval in much more specificity. But those are kind of the highlights that we'd like you all to focus on. Your last chapter in the application is more detail around the GMQS and the existing audits that are in place and the future review of what we think is generated, all kind of proving out the ability to stay within the 164.4. So that's the last chapter of the body of your application. The rest is a multitude of appendices that will make for fabulous bedtime reading and encompass the other 600 or so pages of your document. With that was about as quickly as I could.
It would have exhausted our material and our audience.
It would have. So yeah, I appreciate you guys sticking with it.
You look at. I'm surprised you didn't fall.
Thank you guys for that presentation. That was a lot of information.
It is.
Very, very helpful. Is very exciting. A lot of exciting things being proposed here. So I think we'll wrap it up. Before we do that, are there any questions or issues that you'd like for these guys to be thinking about between now and our next meeting? Or we can
I just have one.
reserve our
We don't
comment
have
for
to
them.
talk about it now.
Yeah,
But
just-
or we can talk about it. You can point me to the right section of the code, or I can answer it myself. But I didn't see a landscaping plan or.
Mike, please.
Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you could talk about at a later date your landscaping plan, and like, do you qualify yourself as logging or tree? Like, how do you handle tree removal? That's my topic for another day. Not right now. Or Suzanne can show me where that applicable code, because I see it's 7/21/30.
Okay, and it sounds like it may be not just landscaping in the sense of how we landscape around Sundeck, but actual,
Tree removal.
yeah, revegetation and stuff like that as well? Okay.
Just a quick discussion of it for 2 or 3 minutes next time would be great. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, great. Well, thanks again, you guys. We'll see you in January. We'll have staff report and presentation, and then some discussion on what we just heard.
Okay.
So,
And just quick before that, I did ask at one, I think the last time we met, which seems like it was a while ago, if people were interested in a site visit. And kind of never. So if I didn't know if anybody wanted to pursue the idea of a site visit, whether it be, sort of that Pandora area or any pieces of this, if you wanted us to try and pull something together, which of course now we're getting towards the holidays, so timing probably gets complicated for these folks. But anyway, I think when I did throw it out, people did express some interest, and that was before we had snow on the ground, and that may make it easier actually, as opposed to more complicated. But just thoughts if that's something you want us to try to pursue.
I mean, if there's still interest, maybe we can try to set that up. Any other comments? I mean, there's probably more interest now that there is snow on the ground, so.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Can we
Obviously-
circulate some possible?
Yeah, we can do that, and obviously that would implicate not doing it at 5:00 in the evening. So,
Right.
it would be, anyway, I can do my best to try and throw out some
Okay.
possibilities, and we'll go from there.
Okay,
So,
great. Well, we will look forward to that.
and I just have two quick
Yep,
things for
sure.
you, separate from these guys. So, but you just want me to be quick because once they start to move, it'll probably
Okay.
disrupt things.
Hang in there. Hang in there,
First,
guys.
Leslie Lamont in the back, our new senior planner. Some of you know her, some may not. But Leslie's been in the Valley for a long time. We're really excited to have her on board. She's started part-time now. After the first of the year, she'll be full-time. And I may be trying to get her to help me with some pieces of this review specifically. But anyway, I just wanted to make sure you all got introduced to her. And then the last piece is you do have a meeting on the 18th of December. I think it looked like from my first polling of people that we had a quorum, but Ellen just really wants to double check to make sure we will really, really, really have a quorum because she is bringing forward this Wolf Creek storage unit injection well location and extent for an oil and gas facility. So I think, I guess of whom we have here, who is
My conflict
available.
that I thought I might have for tonight
Move to that
may
date.
end up being that
Okay.
day, so I'm not sure yet.
Our other, I left my little sticky note upstairs that had who I heard back from, who was coming. So, who else was available on the 18th? You were here. I think you were good for all the dates. Not the
Zach.
18th. Okay.
Joe, are you here?
Was that? I think you said okay to dates.
Chelsea, you here?
was that a date
I'll
that
be
works
in
for you?
Aspen.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Cool. Great. That helps. So, that's it.
Great.
Can I throw out two late comments to the? You guys? Sorry, it's a very formal presentation. Thank you.
Did you red light on?
Two things for next time. Can I add them, or am I too late in the agenda?
Meeting is still going.
Excellent. Two items. One, you're growing acreage by 21% and comfortable chair capacity, whatever your CCC is, comfortable carrying capacity by 7.5%, yet no growth in FTEs, and you're in the service industry. So could you just elaborate? You're growing acreage and growing chair capacity. So just address that further, because I think you did an amazing job on the water. And then the follow-up sort of on the water then is, if we do have the disastrous year, if we do have the drought, you sort of stopped at curtail water use. Could there be a call back to SKICO to maintain in-stream flows at that point, since you now have 3 storage facilities? And again, it's not for tonight, but it's,
okay.
I think you sort of stop, but the plot would really be from there. That's the disaster situation. If you're curtailing water use, what are we doing for Maroon and Castle in terms of maintaining minimum in-stream flows?
Okay.
So,
I would suspect that it's this. They're a customer of the city, so the city's providing them pursuant to their water rights. Their water rights are administered in priority along with an in-stream flow water right. So how those all interplay would kind of be how it is. But
That's the correct answer. We actually have no power over it at all.
Okay.
It's entirely in the city's hands at that point. We're literally just a customer.
Okay. Cool. Those are the 2 things.
So
Thank you.
Short answer on that one.
And then thank you for all the stuff you're doing on the hydrology, and I'm assuming turbidity and all those other fun things that you didn't cover, but because I know it's still an issue in
And it's
snow
all
mass.
in there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the reversing the flow, the quality of your water pipe in your domestic system, as far as just how they maintain it, flooring it, et cetera, is not what we do up at the snowmaking.
Right.
So you can't reverse the snowmaking water back in through the city system without causing a major problem.
Yeah, my question, I guess mine was really more about in-stream flows.
Oh, yeah.
Because the graph always looked, the 2 graphs were really rosy. You always had headroom. And the key concern this summer in Snowmass and Capital, for example, was all the ag use was sort of being arbitrated against, and then you've got the snowmakers coming in sort of at the tail end of a growing season when stream flows are de minimis. So it's really, are you then, for example, Snowmass Waste Sanitation is sort of saying we'll maintain in-stream flows and weigh that against snowmaking.
Gotcha.
So it's something similar going on in Castle and Maroon. So it's really just finishing that puzzle, which I think, you did a great portrayal of, but I think that one missing piece.
Great. Anybody else? Okay. I think we've addressed everything for tonight. I will declare this meeting adjourned, and we will see you guys in January.
Thanks.